Before we start the session, I want to introduce you briefly to who will be on today. But before that, let me situate this panel a little bit. Around 1997, for those of us who study urban China, we received a rather surprising piece of news. All of a sudden, Chongqing was supposed to be the largest city in China. We were like, what? Right? How could that be possible? And then we realized that was made possible by the annexation of more than 20 counties and different towns around the original city of Chongqing, and to become the fourth city directly under the Chinese central government, 直辖市, right? So we know there were 3 直辖市, or cities directly under the Chinese central government until that point, and none other city has ever changed their status, except this time Chongqing. So Chongqing all of a sudden changed from a city, still relatively bigger size, a few million, to something like 20 million or so, and its territory expanded in multitude. I would say 20 times if we have a map to show that. That's where Professor Nick Smith's work took place. And so this story also illustrates the trajectory and pathway of urbanization in China. So we all know, we've heard a lot of news reports and research reports, books, and articles, countless, about the large migration flows from the countryside of China to the cities. And so we know it's unprecedented migration flow, myself included as a scholar of that movement, but much less talked about, but should be talked about, is the so-called in-situ urbanization. That is, places changing from agriculture to urban, and people who stayed behind change as a result. So Professor Nick Smith's work traces that process, more or less the in-situ urbanization I just mentioned, but also to really look at this urbanization, how it has fundamentally altered the social and community fabric of villages in China, especially villages that are not too far from cities, but have always been able to maintain its lifestyle, its community fabric, and its governance structure. But since the early 1980s and the subsequent decades, those traditional forms, or I shall say folk forms, also have undergone significant change. So I think you are in for a treat, for a really deep-seated narrative of how that change takes place in this very important setting that I just described to you. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panelists, and especially Professor Nick Smith. And just a quick word about myself. So I also study China, urban China. I'm a professor of urban planning in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. I'm also the interim dean of the school. And I'm really pleased that Professor Xiaobo, or Xiaobo Liu, will be moderating the panel once the discussion gets started. So Professor Xiaobo Liu is the Whitney Olin Professor of Political Science at Barnard College. Xiaobo was the founding director of the Columbia Global Centers in Beijing and the former director of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. He is the co-author of Danwei, Changing Chinese Workplace in Historical and Comparative Perspective and Taxation Without Representation in contemporary rural China. His current research explores the rise of the regulatory state in contemporary China. And I'm also very, very pleased to introduce Professor Nick Smith. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Architecture and the Urban Studies program at Barnard College in Columbia University. Prior to joining Barnard, he was a faculty member in the Urban Studies program at Yale and US College in Singapore. His recent work has appeared in journals such as Urban Geography, Anthropology, and the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research. In addition to his research on China's urban-rural relations, he's also currently working on the history of industrial policy and zone development in China, Singapore, and Taiwan. So Nick, or Professor Smith, will first really outline the key narratives of his book, The End of the Village. And then following that, we'll have three distinguished urban and China scholars to offer their perspectives in a format of panel discussion. And first is Professor Wing-Shing Tang at Hong Kong Baptist University. Prior to his retirement, he was a professor in the Department of Geography at Hong Kong Baptist University. His research interests focus on interrogating Lafbray, Fahal, Harvey, and other mainstream urban thinkers from the perspective of Hong Kong, mainland China, and India. Recent research has been published in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research and Eurasian Geography and Economics. And he is the co-editor of Urban China Reframed. His current projects explore themes of displacement and post-gentrification. Professor Deborah Davis is Professor Emerita in the Department of Sociology at Yale University. Deborah has authored and edited numerous books on Chinese urban society, including, for instance, The Consumer Revolution in Urban China and Urban Spaces in Contemporary China. She's currently working on research related to the social consequences of uneven urbanization in Chinese cities and the marriage and housing arrangements of the post-1980 generation in Shanghai. Professor Andrew Kipnis is currently professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, prior to which he was a faculty member at the Australian National University. His research addresses social, cultural, and political change in contemporary China. His recent books include The Funeral of Mr. Wang, Life, Death, and Ghosts in Urbanizing China, From Village to City, Social Transformation in a Chinese County Seat, and edited volume entitled Chinese Modernity and Individual Psyche. So as you can see, all of the panelists have extensive experience working on rural and urban China and on different subject matter across disciplines. So we have a truly interdisciplinary panel awaiting for the discussion. With that, I'd like to welcome you to this panel again that is organized by the Architecture Department at Barnard and Columbia University, as well as the Urban Studies program at Barnard, and co-sponsored by the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. So with that, I would welcome Xiaobo or Nick.
Thanks, Weiping. I will start. And thank you as well to the Architecture Department and Urban Studies program at Barnard, as well as Weatherhead and GSAP, as well as SEPA for their support in making tonight's event possible. I am going to share my slides. I also want to thank in advance all of the panelists, Weiping, Xiaobo, Wing-Shing, Deborah, and Andrew. Thank you for your time and energy in reading the book and coming here tonight. I look forward to your comments very much. So what I'm going to do just briefly at the outset here is to provide an overview of some of the main arguments in the book as context for the comments and discussion to come. The starting point for the end of the village is really the rapid urbanization of China over the past 40 years of the reform era, beginning in the early 1980s with reform and opening, and really accelerating in the 1990s following Deng's Southern Tour and fiscal reform in 1994. But this rapid urbanization has really been built upon the exploitation of rural areas and the systematic extraction of labor, land, resources, capital from rural areas and populations in order to feed China's rapid urbanization during this period. And this system of sort of rural extraction and rapid urbanization has really been built upon a very particular circumstance in China's development, where on the one hand, it has a set of quite strict divisions between urban and rural sectors of society that it has inherited from the socialist period. Things like the hukou or household registration system, which separates people into urban and rural populations, or the land management system that separates land into urban and rural land. So these quite strict de jure formal separations between urban and rural, while on the other hand, during the reform era, urban and rural areas and populations have increasingly been allowed to intersect and connect and mutually entangle with each other in informal processes of urban transformation. And so China's rapid urbanization has really been built upon this mismatch between the strict de jure separation of urban and rural and the informal interconnection between urban and rural through processes, for instance, such as migration or peri-urban land expropriation. And that is really one of the sort of central arguments that overarches the book, is this mismatch between categories and processes as a central generative force in the nation's urbanization over the course of the reform era. Now, this approach to urbanization, relying on the extraction of resources and labor out of rural areas, has also produced a variety of challenges. And that really came to a head in the late 1990s with a sort of a burgeoning rural development crisis that has been referred to in China as the three rural problems, or San Nong Wen Ti. And it's this rural development crisis that confronts Hu Jintao and Wen Xiaobao as they come to power in the early 2000s to lead China's national government. And in response to that crisis, Hu and Wen and the central government articulate a new approach to urban and rural development, which is referred to as urban-rural coordination, or in Chinese, Chengxiang Tongzhou, which represents sort of a fundamental turn in the way that the Chinese government thinks about urban and rural development. So whereas in the past there was an effort to strictly separate urban and rural areas along these sort of de jure divisions, increasingly, as part of urban-rural coordination, there is an effort to extend urbanization to rural areas, to formally include rural territories and populations into urban development processes. And that effort continues through the past 2 decades through a variety of policies underneath urban-rural coordination, including, for instance, the Socialist New Countryside, but also into the period under the leadership of Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, where the language of urban-rural coordination falls away, but the fundamental policies are continued through programs such as the National Plan for New Type Urbanization, and most recently, the Rural Revitalization Program. And so the book explores the experimental implementation of urban-rural coordination in the late 2000s and early 2010s, but the insights into that implementation are really applicable to a larger effort that begins in the early 2000s and really continues to the present day. So the way that I approach that is, as Weiping observed, to focus in on the provincial level municipality of Chongqing in China's southwest, which in 2007, so a decade after being promoted to provincial level status, is designated as one of the first 2 national level pilot areas for experimenting with this new policy of urban-rural coordination, with the other pilot area being the nearby city of Chengdu. So the book explores this experimental implementation of urban-rural coordination in Chongqing, and even more specifically zooms into an experiment within an experiment. So the bulk of the book is an ethnography of the implementation of urban-rural coordination and the resulting transformation of the administrative village of Hailong, which you see here outlined in black on the sort of western expanding peri-urban edge of the main city of Chongqing. So Hailong, during this period of urban-rural coordination, has urbanized very rapidly, transforming in the early 2000s from a relatively sleepy agricultural backwater to, by the late 2000s, into a vibrant industrial estate with more than 15,000 migrant workers from various parts of China's west. And then in the early 2010s, transforming yet again to leave behind its industrial past, to refocus on commercial real estate development, to build a conference center, to develop agricultural tourism, industrialized agriculture, high-tech industry, et cetera, to make a turn towards the tertiary sector. And my exploration of this experimental implementation is to compare the approaches of 3 different groups of actors operating at 3 different scales of action, each of which has a sort of a different understanding of what the rural development crisis is about, and what urban-rural coordination means, and how that should transform the future of rural China and its interaction with the urban. And so that includes, for instance, on the left, the residents of the village, the registered villagers and migrants working in the village who live in the communities and neighborhoods across the village. And then in the middle here, the scale of the administrative village and the cadres and village leaders who are seeking to harness urban-rural coordination to drive village development. And then finally, the municipal planners and policymakers who are working on urban-rural coordination at the level of the region or the municipality. Now, if we sort of take the state's rhetoric at face value, urban-rural coordination is an effort to apply scientific planning principles to the resolution of a variety of urban-rural contradictions that have arisen as a result of China's rapid development and the sort of opposition between urban and rural areas in order to pull apart these artificial divisions between urban and rural, so that instead of rural areas supporting urban development, now it's intended that urban areas support rural development, so that industry promotes agriculture and cities carry the countryside. And yet, if we dig deeper into these policy documents, we realize that urban-rural coordination at the same time is very much intended to promote China's continued and accelerated urbanization. This is not just a rural development program, it's also a way of expanding urbanization dramatically to encompass nearly the entirety of China's territory and population. And it does this through a variety of ways, including most notably through hukou reform, the reform of the household registration system in order to encourage the permanent resettlement of rural migrants into towns and cities, as well as through land reform, which encourages the demolition and relocation of villages as high-rise new towns or as the extension of urban peripheries. And this leads me to the second sort of major argument of the book, which is that urban-rural coordination is fundamentally transforming China's rural villages and what it means to be a village in China. And we see this reflected quantitatively with a 20 to 30% decline in the number of villages during the period of the implementation of urban-rural coordination. But we also see it qualitatively. Even the villages that remain, that are still there, are also being fundamentally transformed according to urban conceptions of the rural. So they're being transformed by urbanites, planners, policymakers, projecting ideas about what the rural should be. And so I see that as a transformation of what I would refer to as the working rural, or the nongcun, into the countryside, or the xiangcun, turning villages into things like rural tourist sites, industrialized farms, ecological protection zones, things that support the needs of urban consumers and middle-class urbanites, rather than necessarily the needs and desires of rural residents themselves. And so that brings me to the final argument that I want to highlight, which is that urban-rural coordination is not so much about eliminating the mismatch between the de jure categories and the de facto processes of urban-rural relations, notwithstanding the claims of the state, but rather the reproduction of that mismatch in new forms that are more easily controlled by the state and that serve the state's objectives of rapid economic development. So I'll conclude there, and I look very much forward to the comments and to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. So before we got into the panel discussion, let me just tell the audience that if you have questions, I think all of you underneath your screen, you will have Q&A function. So you can start thinking about your questions and then read the question in there. You will only see your own question, but I will see all the questions. So I will, at the end, after the panelists speak, and then Nick Smith's response, and then we'll start the question and answer period. Okay. So without further ado, let me turn to Professor Tang.
My overall comment of the book is that it is a fantastic read, full of good insights. Nick has asked me to concentrate my comments on urban-rural relations, and so this is what I shall do in the rest of my speech. There are 3 points of contention. First, the simplest one is Hailong, urban-rural coordination program development experience, labeled by Nick conclusively as the end of the village, an exception or exemplar. As was the debate about Shenzhen between Zhu Jiaming and Michael Lee somewhat 25 years ago. I'm afraid that it may not be the exemplar for certain. First of all, the development experience of Hailong has a somehow unique power dynamic. Jiang Yangjing, the party secretary of the village, has been highly praised in both provincial and national leadership circles. These power dynamics are, I'm afraid, unavailable to many villages around the country. Then, the urban processes may be more exceptional than many other villages, including those undergoing poverty alleviation resettlement program, especially for ethnic minorities. It may be too early to conclude that there is, in China, the end of the village. Second, his formulation has somehow reflected Nick's academic and then cultural baggage. Now, fundamental to it is the European and US planning theory. The separation between categories and process seems to bring me back to the debates between procedure and substantive argument, first coined by Hightower 40 or so years ago. Now, same to feedbacks, rationality and power, democracy in practice. Development of all these theories may need a longer interrogation in the Chinese context. When it comes to the analysis of the process, same as Einstein's letter of participation, North's institutionalism, Cole's property relations and transaction costs, Moloch's growth machine, and Macfarlane's assemblage. All these theories need a vivid clarification how relevant they are before applying to the case of vanguard statism. Having said all these, I must praise the application of anthropological theory of Wing-Shing to analyze the urban-rural entanglement of village residents in Chapter 3, Living on the Edge, where mutual relations are found far beyond Hailong's territorial territories, entangling geographies, resources, and opportunities throughout China's territory and beyond. What is really lacking, I would say, are political and sociological theories on the socialist state and Chinese vanguardism. What I have in mind is how democratic centralism has defined, affected, and perpetuated urban-rural relations. In advocating the understanding of urban-rural relations on the ground, Nick has grouped my understanding in the 2019 EGE paper and Andrew Kipnis together to simple yin-yang type of relations. In fact, my paper has tried to understand from the formation of urban-rural relations from the dynastic empire building. There, I drew on the two-tier governing relationship to theorize the mutual embeddedness between town and country. This reminds us to understand the present from the past, urging to have urban-rural relations in essence versus urban-rural relations in implementation. This requires a longer elaboration of the history so as to make the present more enlightening. My third contentious point relates to Nick's Asia agenda for urban studies. I would like to draw his attention to simple fact that in China, the status of being a city or town can be even designated, as we have observed after the Great Leap Forward, in which 52 Xi between 1961 and 1965 were designated, whereas the number of Zheng decreased from 4,429 in 1961 to 4,032 in 65. Now, this may not have been found in the West, at least not in such a scale, and also for other reasons. Besides, as Lin Chun has argued in the Transformation of Chinese Socialism, that China differs from other developing countries. It is H3, history 3, not history 2, due to a social contract furnished by the revolution and the party's long-time mobilization at the grassroots. and China's external relation with liberal and regional Cold War contenders during early socialism. Given these structural differences, it might be difficult to abstractly understand other Asian countries in similar terms of the dialectical relations. Finally, I'm not at ease with the idea of theorizing the Chinese formulation backward to the West. Let me emphasize by way of conclusion that the above is meant to interrogate Nick, who is already a world-class scholar with the sole objective of suggesting ways that he can further perfect the already excellent arguments. The book is an excellent text on urban-rural relations, and I would, without any doubt, recommend it to all readers, not just those from China studies, but also urban studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Davis?
Thank you. Thank you for the department for inviting me to join the panel. Of course, I'm sorry we're not on a panel where we could be seeing each other and seeing you in the audience. I still find after 2 years of teaching and performing on Zoom, it's difficult to read the audience. All I can see is my own face. So what I talked to Nick about before, for the audience who haven't read the book, I just quickly took a picture of the table of contents, and I think this complements what Professor Tang said, zeroing in on 4 of his particular concerns, some of which I would share, but they're not where I'm going to take my comments, my 10 minutes. So I just want to run over that introduction so you all get a sense of the scope of this book. It's one of the best books I read last year, and I have been recommending it to a wide range of friends who work on Chinese subjects, people who are teaching about China, and people who are fascinated by the extraordinary size of Chinese cities. And this is one thing that I would flag in the pictures you saw it, and perhaps in the discussion, is there is a dystopian aspect, I find, to the scale, not just the speed, of what has appeared in the built environment. And Nick Steps he mentions it, he has pictures, but the book is about the process. He's already given you an overview. It's China's new era of urbanization. He's particularly focused on what's happened since Chongqing was made provincial, in particular, since the passing of this policy for, in English, is called urban-rural coordination. When that takes off, urban planning has a different scope, I would say, than before. It really is very clearly a national program with regional variation, but those of us on the outside looking in are very impressed by the ambition of the Chinese state, starting with Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. As Nick said, after the Sannong, the end of the 90s, something had to be done. So we think of Hu and Wen as being those who push social welfare. I hadn't realized till I read the book that they were so tied to this urbanization project as part of addressing rural problems. I had come into this subject with Pierre Landry and Tan Juan at PolyU in Hong Kong, looking at what's happened since 2014. So I found it, Nick, quite useful, the way you step back. So while how far you're supposed to go back in history is something we all can talk about. I would say one of the things I gained right away, the new era of urbanization, it brought me into looking at the Hu Wen era and then the Xi era and how that goes forward. Then you can see the 6 topics: urbanization by other means, planning under urban-rural coordination. And then chapters 2, 3, and 4 are these 3 levels that he told you about. The growth machine, which is working at the level of the planners, living on the urbanization by other means, the planners, the growth is, the village growth is 2, 3 is living on the edge as the residents. So those 3 chapters are kind of circling around and giving you different cuts of the same time period. And then he moves on, this coordinative planning, into the more recent work about what are they going to do. And the 3 pictures you saw showing what it looked like in the mid-90s, when this was a very poor village of 2,000 people, where 70% of the adults had gone out to work. And then 10 years later, it's 2,700 residents and 13,000 migrants. And it's turned itself into one of these rural industrial hubs, serving other larger enterprises, was my impression. And then 2018, Nick's last visit, and the last slide he showed you, you see this unbelievable urban-rural settlement, which looks like planned cities of tens of thousands of people. I don't know the exact, it's 20,000 or 30,000, which are built all over China. These instant residential conglomerations that also have different kinds of support for rural residents, for those residents in these vast developments, but do not have any, as far as I have seen and what I saw in his slide, no productive function. So this is an extraordinary place, as Professor Tang said. Nick is very clear that it's an extraordinary place. It's an experiment. It's also picked up by Xi Jinping as a particularly successful experiment. So all of us in any country, but particularly look at China, if the national leadership decides you are a national model, clearly your path is different than others and your success is probably more likely. That said, by the time you get to chapter 6, the end of the village, the experience of displacement, it's something quite different. This very, very canny party secretary of the administrative village, who you saw in that middle picture, had left the village in the early 80s to go to Shandong, where he became an entrepreneur in the construction industry and was super successful. And he comes back and he is their party secretary. And as we discover in the end of the village, he negotiates this extraordinary transformation of use rights to create a shareholding corporation. I'm not going to go into more detail, but just to give you a sense of the extraordinary richness of this book. Each chapter can stand alone if you were assigning it, or if there's a thing one piece of it you want to understand. That said, I want to flag some of the insights or surprises for me, even though I have spent a lot of time thinking about these same questions. And I think I don't have all the time to run through everything I've said in my notes. Nick, the thing that jumped out and what I shared with my colleagues at Tsinghua, where I was teaching in the Schwartzman program, and I did the lecture on urbanization and migration after Barry Naughton had done the China Miracle, was the idea of a simulacrum or simulacra. Nick makes the argument, and he showed you in that slide, that the Cun has become these 4 different things. It may be a new town, it may be an industrialized zone, it may be an ecological zone, or it may have become a leisure zone for people living in the city. And I'm still turning that over, this idea that village is not only transformed and hollowed out, but it's also a simulacra. It's not a real village. And I think that is actually getting to this issue about production and work. In your comments here, and perhaps in the book also, cities, towns as locations of economic activity. And I guess I'm thinking about manufacturing, which has been so important to China's rise through greenfields, and particularly in the South, while the old industrial base was really hollowed out, the whole Northeast. And so I guess that's one of the things I'd be interested for you to talk more about, is how this issue of production and economic function operates in these new urban concatenations that have appeared in China at different scales. Nick himself asked me to address my thought on, let me see how you said, what I want to say again about urban, you said about rural-urban relations, the same thing that Professor Tang also did. And I would just start by emphasizing for the last 10 years, I have been lecturing and writing about going beyond the rural-urban binary. For those of us who are sociologists and you do survey research or have to rely on other people's surveys, one of the most problematic, one of the greatest challenges to us has been that the surveys have people sorted into two groups, urban and rural. And what's very obvious to everyone on this call is what even the Chinese term urban is extremely heterogeneous, and also what is termed officially rural is also heterogeneous. So in my own work and also when I lecture, I try to introduce the idea of a spectrum of settlement and also a variation in hierarchical administrative position. And therefore, I think that's something that perhaps, Nick, you will want to expand on to talk about how Hailong, which was previously two villages that were then combined, how that fits in this spectrum of ruralness and urbanness, and going beyond the binary. I think the book definitely does it, but I'd be interested to have you talk more. I'm just briefly going to, I think I can control my screen. I hope I can, yes. This is something Nick pointed out. I'm just returning to that. And that's for those of you on the call who may not be deeply involved in China. One of the extraordinary things about China is while maybe 70% of people live in areas that are deemed urban, those people who are legally considered to be urban and depending on the survey are therefore counted as urban is far lower. And what was striking, and you can see that in this slide we did in my lecture, in this last 2 years, it's increased. We had assumed that after these reforms, other things happening, that there would be closing of the gap. In fact, it's widening. So that speaks, I think, to Dr. Tang's point, Professor Tang's point, about where it's going and what about those people who are also still living, actually, as well as being termed rural residents. The other thing to flag is something that Nick knows well. It's in the book, but it didn't come out in the remarks. So I want to emphasize it for those of you who aren't focused on China. When Weiping said that there's two kinds of urbanization that we usually look, migration, they leave the village and they go to the city, but China's urbanization has been, it depends on the time period, but it's probably mostly, slightly, the majority is driven by the horizontal territorial expansion. So areas that were deemed urban grew by allowing the city to annex the peri-urban areas, and then those persons would be counted, or that space would be counted as urban. Whether the people are counted or the space is urban is actually a research problem. And this particular experimental Hailong gives us, I think, further insight into this. It's not totally distinctive. China is not the only country that has used what we call territorial expansion as a means of urbanizing. They are not alone, but I do believe they are at a scale that no other country has done. And so as we think about China being an example, we need to think about the process. And of course, the other point, which we've made, but we'll make more for those of you who aren't focused on China, China is, unlike any of the other countries that are compared at the end of the book, the only landowner. Yes, I'm on the last slide. So this is really important to understand. When land is urban land, it is state land, and that's it. They can do what they want, the government agent at the municipal level. The last slide is just for your record and onward. This issue that, again, Professor Tang just flagged, that it can go backwards. That is, there were areas that were initially urban in China, and then they were de-urbanized. And so this comes from table 2 in Ren Xiaofei's new book, Governing the Urban in India and China, where she emphasizes the 6 different points in time when what was called a city or a town was redefined. And you'll see, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, it was tied to production early on. So was this farming or non-farming? And now China's in a place where, of course, there are still farmers, but there is a great deal of non-agricultural activity going on in farm areas. And then the question is, what kind of economic activity is going on in this heterogeneous space termed urban?
Andy?
Yes, thank you very much to Nick for inviting me here. And I would just also like to say I thought it was a great book. It's really amazing. So I'll just read a few comments here. So the book is a detailed discussion of the process of planning combined with the ethnographic study of a particular village. And the book is organized at 3 levels of research. So the first level is looking at planners, city planners, mostly in the city of Chongqing. The second level is looking at the cadres of this village called Hailong, which is an artificial village located just outside of Chongqing, led by this famous guy, Yan Jing. And then the third level is the villagers themselves. And it seems to me there are 2 chapters on each level. Now, the village becomes more closely connected to the downtown area of Chongqing when a new tunnel is built through a mountain. So there's a particular infrastructural development that links the village more closely to the city, in addition to the kind of administrative changes that Nick and Deborah and others have highlighted. And, you know, one of the things I really liked, one of the insights of the book I really liked is his, he says that urbanization and what is, quote, the urban itself is always caught up in the contradiction between official categories. So that's things like the household registration law that you saw there, or the classification of land as rural or urban. And then on the ground processes of what sociologists might call urbanization. And so now let me say a bit about each of these 3 groups. So the planners in Nick's book, we see they're always caught between scientism and politics. So between the politics of urban planning and claiming their plans are scientific. And the fact remains that there are always multiple plans manipulated by various levels of government and industry in order to maximize their own profits and minimize their own costs. And the planners often use the language of standardization. They mock the, quote, uncoordinated plans, which just means plans that aren't under their own control, and the, quote, perversities of villagers in the city in general. But the planners, the city planners themselves, are also affected by politics, particularly the politics of the city's budget. So the city gets taxes from industry, but has to pay for the social reproduction costs of its urban citizens. And it also earns money from land sales, right? With the conversion of land from rural to urban. And consequently, what the city government really hates is when other parts of the government can control the land sales and make new urban people that the city government then has to pay for the costs of. And so, and the final dimension here is sort of the structure of the Communist Party, which is very Leninist. And so the planners are always needing approval from higher level cadres in the system. And then everything gets paralyzed when there's sort of no one appointed, when there's a vacuum in the leadership. Now, the second level is at the village cadres. And, you know, as Deborah has mentioned, this guy Yan Jing seems to be a real dynamo. And so He first leads construction teams outside of the village, and then he leads the industrialization of the village itself. So the village government constructs a kaifachu and rents out to outside manufacturers. But then the village cadres realize the limits of this sort of development. You can only make so much money from industry, and they realize there's much more money to be made by building high rises and sort of getting into the tertiary sector. And as others have also mentioned, this village leader becomes kind of a model in the Chinese system, which gives them a lot of power. So they have, even though he's just a village cadre, even some of the people in the city government are threatened by him and not quite willing to confront him. But they have their own problems as well. They're always short of money for their plans. So they push each other to invest their own money. They try to get all the other villagers to invest. And apparently they also borrow from gangsters, which gets them into a bit of trouble. As a result of all this dynamism, there's a lot of unclarity. It's unclear. The ownership rights of the apartments are unclear. Might the city usurp them? And I would also say that the cadres, because they're some of the biggest investors in this process, they're also putting themselves kind of more at risk than the average villager. So they're taking big risks. They try to get other people to buy into these risks, but because they're taking bigger risks than anybody else, they're also kind of separating themselves from the other average villagers. Now, the villagers themselves that Nick analyzes, they spend a lot of time in, sort of their community and what he calls the ganqing exchanges, the eating and visiting each other. And one question I had was, is this a particular subset of the villagers? Perhaps those who are unemployed and have a lot of time to visit their neighbors and so on and so forth. But in any case, in his analysis, he shows us how many of these villagers are very reluctant to give up on their community. So when you build these huge high rises and you bring in all these outsiders, it kind of destroys this very local community. And the villagers are also very unsure about the risks that are involved in the investments that the cadres are constantly pushing on them. The villagers lose land and income, and they become dependent on the cadres or the shareholding company. And as Deborah has mentioned, it's very clear that this village originally was not a lineage village, but kind of an artificial one. And there are many divisions among the villagers themselves. So at one point, Nick suggests that the very well-off villagers and the very poor villagers are actually the groups that are more happy with urbanization, at least initially. But by the end of the book, everybody is feeling a bit nervous about the potential risks of urbanization, as Deborah highlighted this. And a lot of this gets expressed through the idiom of ghosts, which is something very interesting to me in my own research. What's quite interesting is out-migration never destroyed the village in the way that this end process of urbanization seems to have done. So I really love the book, and I have sort of 3 or 4 types of questions that I'd like to raise. So one is, I'm an anthropologist, so I'm kind of most closely to the sort of last group, the villagers themselves. And so I have some questions about the sampling and the research that Nick did among the villagers themselves. I wasn't quite clear, who he talked to and who he didn't talk to, and what problems there might have been in terms of which villagers he was getting a hold of. And I was really wondering also about gender. So, gender is very important in land rights in rural China, and sort of marriage patterns, if there's village exogamy, and things like that. And so really curious about how differences in gender might have affected people's feelings about the urbanization. Were there, for example, many bachelors who only have recently been able to marry because of the increased prosperity of the village? Divisions in education levels. A second area of my question was, so, you know, a lot of people in the village are going to have their household registration transformed from rural to urban. And there could be advantages of this and disadvantages of this. But I'm really wondering of the particularities of the advantages and disadvantages of this in this particular context. So, you know, in this particular village, in the environment of Chongqing, what's the difference between an urban hukou and a rural hukou? Does it affect what schools your children can go to? Does it affect what job licenses you can get? And this varies greatly, you know, around China, exactly what sort of difference this change makes. And then I had a really big question about the planners. So, you know, the book is really great in showing how the process of planning is really a political process. And there's all these political tensions over planning. And that's a real strength of the book. But I was wondering, is Nick trying to talk himself out of a job? So are you saying that planning really has no use and that all these that planning is just politics? And so the planning itself doesn't really matter. And so then we don't need urban planners and we don't need university departments that focus on urban planning. I don't think you really want to say that. But then my question would be, so what difference does the planning itself make? What difference does this sort of expertise in planning make to the process? And then I guess finally, I would just like to say that perhaps in a slightly opposite direction from Professor Tang, I'm wondering about some of these, the insights that we can get out of sort of really crude development theories, which I don't think are totally irrelevant here. So one aspect of it is an iron rule of development I once heard was that in all countries, at the start of a development process, the rural is always feeding the urban. But at a certain point in the development process, it always turns around and the urban begins to feed the rural. And so, you know, of course, if you look at countries like the United States today, we know there are huge agricultural subsidies and all sorts of money is being pulled out of cities and fed into these rural areas. But I have been told that this is just absolutely standard around the world. You know, you look at the level of development and the, you know, how things are going in this way. And the other thing is, you know, your slide about a working village going into the countryside. I think that's really, really interesting. But I also think just sort of this classic distinction between what is a peasant, that is someone who grows food for their own family's consumption and lives in a village, and what is a farmer, that is someone who grows food to sell on the market and is just another type of business person, is also very relevant. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Before I turn to Nick, let me use my privilege as a moderator to kind of ask a couple more questions from a political science point of view. I guess this last Andy's point is really from anthropologist looking in. I wanted to take you outside of it, actually, outside the village. So the question I have is how generalizable, how typical is the village that you studied, since this is a very much of an ethnographic study. I think Andy mentioned something in his remarks I thought was very important, which I have the question. That's, I think Debbie also mentioned, its location, right? I think last time I heard you talk about the book, I asked about it because it's very unique. It's if we recall that map, it's right outside the city. but it's not really rural. It's almost part of urban sprawl, or maybe it's not quite. So in that sense, it's very important, because the reason I'm asking this is relate to my second question is about the land. You mentioned that a lot in the book. So land is crucial, right? Land is the sort of the physical kind of, resources, the source of physical revenue by local governments in implementing urbanization and using it as a part of that lever, that as part of generating more physical resources. So if the land is situated in a near a city, and that makes the land constraint less. The reason asked because if you go further inland, mountainous area, those villages, land would probably worth less or worth less. And how would those leaders, local leaders, that urbanization we know also take place maybe using different kind of strategy, right, over time. And so again, that's the question related to how generalizable this village that you studied in terms of overall urbanization in China. So it's a broader question, but that's for you. I guess just to bring you out of the village and think about the book, the larger implication of your book, Nick. So let me give Nick some time to respond, and then we'll open up for question and answers.
Great, thanks, Xiaobo, and thank you, Wing-Shing and Debbie and Andrew for these great comments. Much more here than I can really sink my teeth into in the next 5 minutes, but I will do my best. Also want to make sure that we save some time for questions from the audience. So let me just pick out a few themes that I see across some of these questions. To address both one of the first questions and one of the last. So Wing-Shing brought up this question of whether Hailong might not be an exemplar, and whether the urban processes here actually might be quite exceptional. And Xiaobo also brought up this question, which I think is an important one, about generalizability or typicality. Yes, so this is something I go into depth on in the conclusion. And I think it's very important to acknowledge the particularity of this village and its circumstance, right? And so we cannot generalize from the specifics of what has happened to Hailong to say that that is going to happen, the exact same thing is going to happen to every other village, or even sort of a majority of villages in China. And in fact, one of the scenes that I describe in the book is the municipal planners in Chongqing talking about precisely that we really can't draw any conclusions from Hailong because it is so distinctive. My view on this is informed by some of the debates in comparative urban studies over the last 10 to 20 years, arguments that have been put forward by scholars like Jenny Robinson and Ananya Roy, which try to move past some of the more quantitative or statistical ways that we think about generalization and comparison, to start thinking through research practices of singularity. So to think of, to use individual cases as ways to, as opportunities to critically revisit some of our conceptual assumptions about how urbanization works, and to critically compare to other sites that we are familiar with, what might at another time have been called naturalistic generalization. And so what I see happening in Hailong, or the way that I'm thinking about Hailong in terms of its comparison to other sites, is that the extremity of Hailong, so its political advantages, its economic advantages, its its very special site on sort of bridging the urban and the rural, provides this moment of intensity that allows us to peel back the sort of layer of what we might call social harmony that gets sort of papered over a lot of urban processes in China, where we don't really get to see a lot of the time the social contestation that is going on underneath the surface. In Hailong, all of that bubbles to the surface, and it becomes what Victor Turner has called a social drama. So it sort of essentializes or crystallizes phenomena that might not look exactly the same in other places, but that gets to mechanisms or processes or dynamics that are shared in different ways in other places. And so that's sort of what I'm trying to do with the specific case study of Hailong. Again, is not to claim that all other villages are the same. That would be ridiculous, right? Every village in China is in some way unique. But to be able to start to get to some of these more fundamental processes that are going on underneath the surface. And so that I think also speaks to something else that Wing-Shing brought up, and that I would push back against a little bit. Wing-Shing, you said that I've conclusively sort of declared the end of the village. That wasn't the intent of the book or of the title. The title is really intended as a provocation, right? The end of the village that I identify is not at all a fait accompli, right? I'm pointing towards a set of tendencies that I think are playing out in very distinctive ways in different contexts across China, right? But I also think that they can be quite subtle, right? They can insinuate themselves into village transformation in ways that we don't even necessarily recognize. So I was doing an event with another anthropologist of China who works in distant rural Guizhou. And this is something that she brought up. She's like, I don't see these processes that you identify happening in my village. But in fact, that village is also undergoing a process of replanning, led by a set of rural planners who come from cities, who are rebranding that village as an ethnic tourist village, which preserves much of the form and even some of the day-to-day social practices that were found in the village before, but is now sort of repackaged and rebranded for consumption by urban residents. And so, even in that circumstance where, the urban seems to be far, far away, the effects of those processes can still be found. Similarly, at the sort of larger level of comparison, Wing-Shing, I think you and I are largely on the same page in trying to find productive ways of thinking Chinese urbanization through the lens of China. I think you are farther down the road there than I am. You've done a ton of great work on this recently. I think I'm slightly more optimistic than you are about the possibilities for making comparisons across contexts. And I think it's really incumbent on us. And this has been a theme in urban studies for decades, right? We go back to some of the arguments made by Janet Abou-Lughod, who urges us to steer a course between the sort of totalizing, universalizing urban theory on the one hand, and on the other hand, the pristine case study, right? And I think it's really incumbent on us to continue to try to navigate that middle ground of respecting the specificity of local context, but also finding ways to draw connections and to learn between places. Debbie, you brought up this question of the simulacrum and the sort of its intersection with the sort of economic activity. Yes, for sure, part of what is going on here is a transformation of the economic basis and the entanglement of rural villages into economic processes that are really centered in cities. So whether that is, urbanites going out for sort of weekend leisure tourism or the consumption of foodstuffs out of villages. For me, though, the designation of the simulacrum, this idea that it's something new that's not quite what it used to be, really comes down to the social relationships in the village and the social organization of the village, where the village has really been the site of the rural social contract for decades, right? It's been where the primary site of rural redistribution and the sort of ensuring of rural welfare, whether that is organized at the level of the administrative village or in these village communities through practices, for instance, of renqing. And what I see happening in these processes of extended urbanization is the displacement of that function, where increasingly rural people are dissociated from their villages, they're separated from their villages, and they're no longer embedded in those processes of social organization and redistribution. And then Andrew, you brought up several good questions on the practice of the ethnography. So let me address first the sampling and research. So, as you know, the practice of ethnography can be serendipitous, right? So this was not, I was not doing a social survey where I was going to house and administering the same survey. It was much more on the level of, the hanging out, the participant observation that is the sort of meat and potatoes of ethnographic work. But I did make an effort to ensure that I was representing a diversity of perspectives. And one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways that I did that was to structure my ethnography for a portion of the time that I was in the village through a mapping exercise. And so the maps that you see in the book, I produced through walking the village, mapping sort of sector to sector. And as I was doing that, also talking to people and interviewing people and observing what was going on, to ensure that I was getting a cross-section of villagers and migrants at different times of day, different days of the week, different parts of the village in a more or less systematic way. Yes, gender makes a huge difference. I mentioned this only briefly in chapter 3. I wish it had been, I wish I had had the opportunity to make it a more central part of the book. But certainly the way that households are structured and the sort of patriarchal values that sort of guide much of rural life in China make a big impact. Am I trying to talk myself out of a job? No. Is planning just politics? It's not just politics, but it is politics, right? And I would go further than that to say that urbanization is politics, right? That urbanization is a process of collective problem solving that is fundamentally political. And what difference does planning make? It makes a difference, but that difference is fundamentally contextual, right? The difference that it makes in China is different than the difference that it makes in, for instance, the United States or Hong Kong or Singapore. And in the context of China, it really is, part of this larger political ecosystem of development that sort of is there to legitimize and justify sort of politically driven urban development activities. So I'm going to stop there. I've already talked too much. I'm really eager to address some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Nick. So we have some questions. Actually, you answered a couple of those related to research, your research methods, and one from Benjamin Cole asked about a similar question. The other one from Wang, but this one you might want to just elaborate a little bit. And that question is, under the current political circumstances, this kind of research that you just did a number of years ago, is that still possible? I guess that's the kind of ethnographical kind of in-depth observation on the ground research. And this person actually said that he or she they did the similar research, but was cut short for apparently political reasons, for some reasons in the Hubei research. So that's the question related to research. The other one also interestingly relate to the concept you raised in your talk, and that is the difference between Nongcun and Xiangcun, and they want you to, Kai Zhang wants you to elaborate on that. I thought it was very interesting. The term Xiangcun has always been referred to the village as a venue of both production and life, hasn't it? So that's a question. The other question by Ang Liu is about will China's continued rapid urbanization aggravate the decline of the countryside and the inequality in urban-rural relations so that it cannot become as rich as its Western counterparts? The question's a little bit unclear. I guess it's just the question, I guess it's asking about whether this rapid urbanization will continue the decline of countryside or aggravate inequality. I believe I think that's the question you want to ask. Nick?
Sure. Let me jump in, and then I'll invite the other panelists to also weigh in on some of these, particularly this question of research in the current circumstances, which I think is a really live issue for the field of China studies. So let me leave that to the end, and I'll address the other ones first. So the contrast between Nongcun and Xiangcun. So I encourage you to read the book because I go into some detail comparing these terms and their etymology and the way that they're deployed in Chinese society. I do see a difference where the Nongcun sort of has connotations of the peasantry and farming and the sort of the work of the rural. That's why I refer to it as, in shorthand, as the working rural. It's what I see as the sort of the village-based rural. Whereas the Xiangcun, etymologically, I think has more of a connotation of sort of a dreamscape or a nostalgia or a conception of the rural, right? Which implies a kind of critical distance, which for me, in this context, I see as a critical distance from an urban positionality. We also see that reflected in sort of state language, where the state's rural is often the xiang. And so you see that, for instance, in the term urban-rural coordination, which is not Chengnong Tongzhou, it's Chengxiang Tongzhou. And this was emphasized to me by urban policy officials in Chongqing, that the rural in urban-rural coordination was not the village for them. Instead, it was the xiang, and therefore directed not necessarily towards the villages, but towards the counties and the towns, which for them were the xiang. And only then might that support trickle down to the villages, which were the nong. So I think this has both a sort of a societal and cultural dimension, but also a dimension in sort of state rhetoric and state policy. The question about aggravating, rapid urbanization aggravating the decline of the countryside, inequality, and economic development. I'll say that the intent of the state, at least according to state policy, is quite the opposite. That the sort of policies of urban-rural coordination and new type urbanization are explicitly designed to try to boost domestic demand. The idea being that urbanites, people with urban hukou who live in cities, are supposed to consume more in their apartments, buying various consumer goods, to consume more than rural residents with rural hukou, and thereby to drive more economic development in China. That being said, it's not clear that that is actually how it pans out. And I would urge people to to read Scott Rozell's new book, Invisible China, which deals with this question of the interlinking of China's larger economic development goals with the urban-rural divide. I'll also say that I think part of what is going on also is an effort by the Chinese state to transpose the urban-rural inequality, which has historically driven China's economic development and urbanization, as that is increasingly gotten rid of, to transpose that inequality, to rescale it. And I think that is part of what is going on with the Belt and Road Initiative. And I argue as much in a recent paper in Urban Geography on the origins, the urban origins of the Belt and Road Initiative. And then the question from Wang on doing research in China. Yes, I think that the truth is that it's increasingly becoming difficult to do this kind of work in China. Not impossible, but increasingly difficult, right? There are more hurdles, and it becomes ever more important to do the things that have always been necessary to do this kind of research in China, which is to have very strong relationships in the places that you're doing research, to really sort of build those relationships over time. But unfortunately, I think many of us are facing the challenges that this participant, Wang, has faced in terms of having some of those relationships cut short and having difficulty pursuing some of this in-depth research. But I would be very eager to hear what the other panelists have to think.
So let me ask Andy to respond to your questions. He also raised a question relate to this concept of sort of urban, this 乡村 versus 农村 kind of concept, which I think is brilliantly important. And so he raised a question in his, and I don't think you addressed it, but you directly, but he asked you whether you see a trend sort of coming back, the city folks going to the 乡村 now it's no longer 农村, right? So do you see that trend? Is it, Andy, is that your question, or is it you actually have some observation? So go ahead, I'll let Andy to comment and answer, and then respond from Nick.
Okay, so yeah, I'm really interested in this question of possibilities for research, and I agree with what Nick said, that obviously relationships that enable the research are going to become more and more important. But I also have a question about the ethics of research. So now it's not just the permissions you need to be able to do the research, but also the fact that, the surveillance has been wrapped up so much in the smartphone era and cameras. It seems to me it's impossible to guarantee any sort of anonymity to your sources. So it will always be possible for the state to trace back who you've talked to now under these new conditions of surveillance. And so I think that makes research ethically also very problematic. And it doesn't really matter if you're Chinese or foreigner, or what your ethnicity is, or what your nationality is. As far as I can tell, the surveillance would make any sort of research always traceable. So that is another type of concern I have under the current regime. And I don't have any answers to that. I'm just really curious what other people think of that. And then, yeah, I was just provoking a bit. I think that the idea of the working village into the countryside, where it's the conceptions of urbanites that really affect what goes on in the village, is important. But I also think the very sort of fundamental transformation of someone who grows food for their own family into someone whose work is basically concerned with earning money, regardless whether you earn money through agriculture, you earn money through tourism, you earn money through being a migrant worker, you earn money through renting out apartments. All of a sudden, it doesn't really matter exactly what you do to earn the money. The question is, how much can you earn, right? So it's a really fundamental different orientation from, can I feed myself and can I feed my family, to how much money can I earn? And, so it's a very classical kind of sociological transformation that I think we can't lose complete sight of that, to only talk about kind of this sort of, I don't know, should I say a postmodern theory of simulacra and, who is defining what the village is. I think that's also important, but I just don't want to lose sight of that other transformation. So that was my only comment there. I do think that, you obviously earning money means you have to market yourself to those who have money. And who has money? Urban people. So marketing yourself to those who have money mean that you have to appeal to the conception of the role of urban people, or do things that other people want, so you can earn money. So that kind of also relates to what Nick was saying.
Nick, you gonna comment further, or just you want to move to another question?
No, I agree with what Andrew was saying, and I think the people in the village that I was working with agree, right? And part of their resistance to this process is their perception that they need to begin participating in those systems to compete, whether as a wage laborer, an entrepreneur, or whatever, and they see some respite from that in keeping contact with the village, right? Whether that is about having access to land, and so there are interesting arguments about semi-proletarianization in China, because some of these rural people are both wage laborers, but also landowners of a sort, or whether it is access to the informal welfare networks that constitute the village community, which again provide a kind of buffer from the sort of systems of capitalist exploitation that we find in sort of contemporary urban society.
Great. Nick, we'll have two more questions. So, and then that's about, just right time. So one question from Stefan Norgard, and the question basically is, do any of the scholarly debate around depeasantization and farewell to the peasantry sort of inspired your, I guess, your book? And if so, how might the process, the end of the village, your work, relate to the process of class and social differentiation / new gender and generational structures that intersect with geography and occupation in complex ways? So that is a question. And then the other one is more specific from Amila Chandalis, said whether when you do your research, did you find anything, how this urban-rural dynamic impact the education system or experience of rural inhabitants? Is something that your research gained insights into. So those are two, and then we'll move on maybe a couple more.
Yeah, thanks. Stefan, this is there are a lot of dimensions to your question, and I know we'll have a chance to meet on campus later, and so I won't do justice to all the dimensions of your question. But yes, so while my work is primarily situated in urban studies, of course, I'm speaking to both the urban and rural studies communities. And so I do, there are ways in which I'm building on some of the work in rural studies around depeasantization. I do think, so some of the conversation we just had about sort of semi-proletarianization, I think provides interesting sort of modifications from a Chinese perspective on some of that work. And to the end of your question, part of what is going on is precisely, so you mentioned Debbie's comment about a spectrum of settlement. So, which is precisely my point, is this apparent contradiction between the binarization of urban and rural in the various sort of systems that are used to discipline Chinese society, and on the other hand, the fluidity of the spectrum of urbanization that goes all the way from rural to urban and everything in between. And the sort of the binary categories cannot capture that spectrum. And so I think that what I'm trying to add to this conversation is that that disjuncture is not necessarily a problem that needs an analytical solution, right? Rather, the disjuncture itself is part of the ongoing process of the production of urbanization. It is precisely the intersection between the transformation of the built environment and the body and lifeways running up against the sort of more rigid conceptual and administrative structures with which we run society. And that collision is an important part of what generates urbanization. So that's one of the sort of core arguments of the book. And Xiaobo, my Q&A, I have lost the other question.
Right. So one more, maybe that's it. I think it was one more question I thought was quite interesting and relate to the comments raised by the panelists first. I mean, this is the last question. So basically, the Charles Starks, so named, wondered if if you look into, research your book, look into the sort of historical precedents in the sort of in urbanization kind of programs. And this person specifically asked, 1930s, Wen Tiejun mentioned that 1930s and the Kuomintang, there's similar kind of a state intellectual-led, not necessarily state-led, rural experimentations, and also there are during Mao's era, there was, others also did a similar kind of, at least they promote the similar ideas. So whether that you look into that and so on, and whether they can be related to today.
Yeah, so it's a great question. The focus of the book is not on that deep history. I gesture at it in the introduction, but the book is primarily concerned with the contemporary. Of course, there are interesting historical through lines. One of them, for instance, being the new rural revitalization movement in the contemporary period, which harkens back to the rural revitalization movement in the early 20th century, dealing with not dissimilar set of challenges in China at a different time. So I don't delve that deeply into that sort of deep history, although I think that's a really promising area of investigation. Where there are substantive historical connections made by my interlocutors in the field are more in the sort of short history back to the 1980s of the reform era. And so in particular, the village leaders in Hailong are very actively engaging exemplars from other parts of China and drawing on their experiences and adapting them to their own circumstances. A particularly prominent example being Huaxi Village, the first village under heaven, which is used as this example that Hailong is aiming to emulate. And so they are building those connections, trying to reformulate what it means to be a village and what village development means, and what the urban future of rural China is going to look like by sort of drawing on that history. And I think that is part of what is distinctive about working on urbanization in this moment and in Western China. There is where it is not an entirely new circumstance. People are drawing on what has come before, and they're learning from it, they're adapting it, and they're updating it to be new. And so, while there are echoes of what has happened in, along the coast in Eastern China in what happens in Hailong, it's also new and distinctive in new ways, precisely because the people in Hailong and other villages like it are learning from what has happened earlier in the coastal provinces. Well, thank you very much, Nick, and all the panelists. I think we have had a very successful a conference or webinar, and I want to also thank all the audience from around the world, in the United States, in Asia, Pacific, and so let's call it a night. Thank you all very much. Thanks.